From awkward silence to confident conversations, my journey to speaking English naturally. Welcome to Smart English Start. This series shares real stories of English learners, people who once felt lost but found unique ways to become fluent and confident speakers. Each story is different, but they all have one thing in common. They learned English through real-life experiences, not just textbooks. Today's story is about Daniel Park, who moved to Los Angeles for work but struggled with casual conversations. He could understand meetings but felt lost when his coworkers joked around or made small talk. He found a unique way to improve by learning English through late-night talk shows. Let's dive into his journey, how he went from awkward silence to confident conversations. Episode 1, Learning English with Late-Night Talk Shows.
Hello, my name is Daniel Park. I work in Los Angeles at a tech company where I use English every day. I lead meetings, make presentations, and even joke around with my coworkers. But when I first arrived in the US, I struggled with conversations. I could understand English in emails and work discussions, but when it came to small talk, jokes, or quick casual conversations, I felt lost. I couldn't keep up. That all changed when I started watching late-night talk shows. Let me tell you how TV helped me go from feeling awkward to becoming part of the conversation. Arriving in Los Angeles, the first challenge. When I landed at LAX, I was excited but nervous. I had studied English for years, but this was my first time living in an English-speaking country. At immigration control, the officer asked, "What's the purpose of your visit?" I had practiced this phrase before, but in the moment my mind went blank. I mumbled, work, and quickly handed over my documents. He nodded and let me through, but I felt embarrassed. A few days later, I joined my team for lunch at In-N-Out Burger in West Hollywood. Everyone was chatting and laughing, but I barely understood what they were saying. The words blended together. The worst part, someone made a joke, and the entire table burst into laughter. I smiled, pretending I got it. But in reality, I had no idea what was funny. That's when I realized, understanding English in meetings wasn't enough. I needed to learn how people actually talked. Feeling like an outsider every day at work, I felt the same way. In meetings, I understood the technical discussions, but when my coworkers casually joked before the meeting started, I stayed quiet. In the break room, when people talked about weekend plans, I smiled and nodded, but I didn't know how to join the conversation. At team dinners, I felt like an outsider. One night, we had a company event at Dodger Stadium. My manager, Mark, spilled mustard all over his shirt. The whole team started laughing. I wanted to say something funny too, but I didn't know what to say. I felt frustrated. I had worked hard to get this job, but I couldn't connect with my coworkers the way I wanted to. That night, I decided I needed to find a way to understand and speak natural English. A surprising solution. After work, I went home and opened YouTube. I wasn't looking for a way to learn English. I just wanted to relax. I randomly clicked on a video of The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. His guest was Ryan Reynolds, and they were joking about funny things that happen in Canada. At first, I only understood 30% of the conversation. They were talking fast, interrupting each other, and using slang. But something about the way they spoke fascinated me. They were not just speaking English, they were having fun with it. It was natural, fast, and full of energy. That night, I had an idea. What if I learned English by watching and copying talk shows? Episode 2, Turning Talk Shows into My Personal English Class. One night, I randomly clicked on a YouTube video of The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. The guests were joking, speaking fast, and using slang I had never heard before. I barely understood them, but something about the way they spoke fascinated me. That night, I had an idea. What if I used talk shows to learn real, natural English? This was the beginning of a completely new way of learning for me. Step 1. Watching without subtitles, training my ears. At first, I made a simple rule for myself. Every night after work, I would watch one episode of a late-night talk show without subtitles. I started with The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, but I also watched The Late Show with Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel Live. The first time, I barely understood 30% of what they were saying. The guests talked too fast. They interrupted each other. The jokes didn't make sense to me, but I didn't stop. Instead of focusing on every word, I focused on how they spoke, their tone, speed, and rhythm. When they laughed, trying to understand what was funny, their body language, how they reacted to each other. Even though I couldn't catch everything, I was training my brain to recognize natural English speech. Step 2, watching again with subtitles, writing down useful phrases. The second time, I watched the same episode, but this time with English subtitles. Now, I could see the words they were saying, and suddenly, things started to make sense. I kept a notebook and wrote down useful phrases, like, "You're killing it." When someone is doing really well, no way. A reaction to something surprising. "That's hilarious." A more natural way to say something is funny. I realized that I had never learned these phrases in school, but they were used all the time in casual English. Step 3, shadowing, speaking like a talk show host. Next, I tried something that completely changed my speaking skills, shadowing. I played short clips from interviews and repeated everything the host or guest said, copying their pronunciation, tone, and speed. For example, I practiced Jimmy Fallon's way of introducing guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome." I also mimicked celebrities like Ryan Reynolds, who spoke with a confident, relaxed tone. At first, I felt silly speaking to my laptop, but after a few weeks, I noticed something amazing. I was starting to speak faster and more naturally. Step 4, using what I learned at work. Now came the real test, using these phrases at work. The next time I was in the break room, a coworker told me he had just finished a big project. Instead of just saying, "Good job," I said, "Dude, you crushed it." He laughed and replied, "Thanks, man." I had used a natural phrase and it felt good. After that, I started using more casual English. Instead of, "That's funny," I said, "That's hilarious." Instead of, "That's impressive," I said, "You're killing it." Instead of, "Really?" I said, "No way." Slowly, I noticed that people reacted differently. They saw me as more natural and friendly. The way they spoke to me changed too. They used more casual, friendly language, which helped me improve even more. Episode 3. The first time I felt confident speaking English. Then, one day, everything changed. I made my first real joke in English without overthinking it, and for the first time, I felt truly confident in my ability to speak. A team event that changed everything. It happened at my company's team event at Dodger Stadium. Our team had rented a suite for the game. Everyone was eating, drinking, and joking around. I sat with my manager, Mark, and a few coworkers trying to follow the conversation. Then, Mark was about to take a bite of his hot dog when he accidentally squeezed too much mustard onto it. The mustard spilled all over his shirt again. The moment I spoke without thinking, everyone laughed, and suddenly, without thinking, I said, "Mark, I think you just invented a new fashion trend." For a split second, I panicked. Did that even make sense? Would anyone find it funny? But then it happened. The whole table burst into laughter. Even Mark laughed and said, "Yeah, mustard yellow is the new black." Couldn't believe it. I had just made a joke in English and it worked. For the first time, I wasn't just listening to the conversation, I was part of it. Why this moment was so important. This may sound like a small thing, but for me, it was huge. I didn't translate in my head. The joke just came out naturally. I reacted in the moment, just like a native speaker. People laughed, which meant I had used the right words and tone. Before this, I was always too careful when speaking. I overthought every word. But in that moment, I realized something important. English is not just about words. It's about timing, confidence, and flow. How I started speaking more naturally. After that, I felt a big change in my conversations. I stopped hesitating when I wanted to speak. I started using humor more naturally in English. I felt more comfortable in group discussions. Instead of feeling nervous, I began to enjoy conversations. I wasn't just learning English anymore. I was living in it. Episode 4: Learning to tell stories like a talk show host. Studying storytelling from the masters. I went back to watching The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, but this time I didn't just listen, I studied. I noticed that whenever guests told stories, they all followed a pattern. Set up the situation. They explained what happened clearly and simply. Add a little suspense. They made people curious about what would happen next. Finish with a punchline. They ended with something funny, surprising, or emotional. I realized that I could use the same structure to tell stories in English at work, with friends, or even at networking events. Asterisk. Practicing storytelling in real life. I started practicing storytelling in everyday situations. At the coffee machine at work, instead of just saying, "I saw a funny movie," I tried telling the whole story in an interesting way. When my team was talking about bad travel experiences, I shared a funny story about the time I almost missed my flight because I went to the wrong gate at LAX. I used gestures, pauses, and facial expressions just like talk show guests did. At first, I wasn't great at it, but the more I practiced, the more natural it became. The first time I told a story that made everyone laugh. One Friday after work, our team went to the Laugh Factory in Hollywood for a comedy night. After the show, we all sat together at a bar, talking about the funniest things that had happened at work. That's when I decided to try telling a story. I told them about my first week in Los Angeles when I accidentally tipped a cashier at Starbucks $50 because I didn't understand how American tipping worked. I set up the situation. So, it was my first time in an American coffee shop, and I wanted to tip like a local. I added suspense. The cashier looked at me strangely, but I just smiled like I knew what I was doing. I finished with a punchline. Later, I checked my bank statement and realized I had basically paid $55 for a latte. My team burst into laughter. One coworker even said, "That sounds like something from a late-night talk show." That was the moment I realized I had become the kind of person who could tell great stories in English. The power of storytelling in conversations. After that, I started using storytelling everywhere. In meetings, I explained ideas through short, engaging stories instead of just facts. At networking events, I told funny personal stories to connect with new people. In casual conversations, I didn't just answer questions, I turned them into mini stories. The result? People started enjoying conversations with me more. They remembered me better. And best of all, I felt confident speaking English no matter who I was talking to. Episode 5: The moment I started thinking in English. I asked myself, how can I stop translating in my head? Then I remembered something I had learned from watching talk shows. Native speakers don't translate, they react. So I decided to train my brain to react in English. Step 1: Describing my day in English. Every morning, while getting ready, I started talking to myself in English about my day. At first, it felt unnatural, but after a few weeks, it became automatic. I also started narrating simple things in my head. I need to buy groceries after work. The weather is nice today. I should email my manager before the meeting. This helped me train my brain to process thoughts directly in English. Step 2: Speaking without planning. Next, I gave myself a challenge. Speak without preparing. Before, when I had a meeting or a conversation, I would always mentally prepare sentences in advance. This made me sound robotic and unnatural. So I forced myself to stop planning. In conversations, I focused on just responding naturally, like native speakers do. First, I made mistakes. I said things like, "Yesterday, I go to the gym," instead of "went to the gym." But I didn't stop myself. I just kept going. And something amazing happened. The more I spoke without planning, the faster my brain processed English naturally. Step 3. Switching my entertainment to 100% English. I realized I was still consuming a lot of content in my native language. I was watching Korean YouTube channels, reading news in Korean, and messaging my friends in Korean. If I wanted to think in English, I needed to surround myself with English. So I made a decision. I changed my phone's language to English. I followed American comedians on Instagram and watched their short clips. I listened to the daily podcast from the New York Times every morning. I read books in English before bed, even if I didn't understand every word. Within a few months, something incredible happened. I started dreaming in English. That's when I knew I had finally started thinking in English naturally. The moment I realized I was fluent. One day, I was in the office break room, making coffee, when my coworker, Jake, walked in. He sighed and said, "Man, I need a vacation." Without thinking, I replied, "Yeah, you look like you need one. Where would you go?" He started talking about his favorite travel spots, and I kept the conversation going effortlessly. After he left, I had a realization. I hadn't planned a single sentence. I didn't translate. I didn't hesitate. I just spoke naturally. That was the moment I knew I was fluent. Final thoughts: the journey never ends. Even now, I'm still learning. I still discover new words, expressions, and slang every day. But the biggest difference is, I'm no longer afraid of speaking. Fluency isn't about being perfect. It's about being comfortable in the language. So if you're learning English, my advice is, surround yourself with English every day. Stop translating. Train your brain to think in English. Practice speaking without planning every sentence. Find a fun way to learn, like watching talk shows. One day, you'll realize that English isn't something you're learning anymore. It's just part of who you are. And that's the moment you'll know you've become fluent.